Anger has its dangers and its opportunities. So today, the danger and opportunity of anger, part 2. And in reality, as one really begins to investigate this from both a position of intellectual neutrality and reflects upon that within one's personal experience, oh my, we could look at part 3 and part 4 and part 5. And I hope that actually that will be the course that some of you take. That when we conclude here, it won't be, okay, done with that, move on. But there may be some issues and challenges in our lives that would call us to continue to look, to reflect, and to seek God's presence. Not necessarily from the Christian tradition, but from words that are wise and applicable to any religious orientation. One said a long time ago, a moment of patience in a moment of anger saves 1,000 moments of regret. That's true. I think all of us could testify to that being true. A moment of patience in a moment of anger saves 1,000 moments of regret. Story is told, maybe it's just a created story for teaching purposes, but it still has relevance. The story is told of a young boy who had anger challenges, anger issues. His father wrestled with this for quite some time. And one day, when the boy wasn't triggered by anger, Dad had a little talk with his son and instructed him that in the future, son, whenever you have an outburst of anger, what I'm asking you to do and instructing you to do is to take a nail with a hammer and pound it into the fence in the backyard. Well, it wasn't long before an anger situation arose, and once that initial emotion and the intensity of that had passed, the boy took a nail and a hammer and he pounded it into the fence. Well, as time went on, another nail went into the fence. As time went on, another nail went into the fence. Time passed to the point where the nails were going into the fence less frequently. In fact, time finally had its healing effect, and with this exercise that there was hardly any nails that were continuing to go into the fence. And then the father instructed his son, now go and pull out every one of those nails. And he did. But there was a hole remaining in the fence where each nail had been pounded. The father then commented, look at the holes in the fence. The fence will never be the same. When you say things in anger, they leave a scar just like this one. You can put a knife in a man and draw it out. It won't matter how many times you say, I'm sorry, the wound is still there. Stories such as this, quotes such as a moment of patience in a moment of anger saves 1,000 moments of regret, all speak to us of the caution of anger. Slow down. Take some time. Someone has commented, speak when you are angry, and you will make the best speech you will ever regret. Been there, done that. And if you're honest, you would have to acknowledge the same. Probably in at least 90% of our experiences. It really wasn't a speech in this particular scenario. It was a letter that I wrote as a pastor. I shared with you last week in somewhat of a vulnerable manner that some of the sources of my anger challenges, ironically, come with the church. And I think that that could probably also be the case for some, maybe even many of you. Because the church is filled with personalities and histories and baggage, and it all comes colliding together, and sometimes it bumps up one another. Well, not here, but many, many years ago, and I don't really even remember what the specific issue was, but a couple of individuals, leaders in that congregation, didn't like what I was doing, and they let me know about it. And you remember last week that I said, I cannot be a spewer in church. I can be a spewer elsewhere, but I cannot be a spewer in church. If you weren't here last week, you're going to get more familiar with that term. But I chose to write a letter. And I'm a fairly competent writer. And it wasn't a long letter, but it was a letter that expressed my displeasure at their approach. And I sealed that letter. Actually, it was 2 letters, same letter to 2 different individuals. And I stamped it and I dropped it in the box. I think that was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, as I recall. About 8 o'clock that night, I go, I should not have done that. Why did I do that? And believe it or not, I went to the post office the following morning in the adjoining community to which both of these individuals resided, about 10 miles away, and I went to the person at the counter. It's a small post office, and I said, I really don't want to go into the details, but I need to get a couple of letters from you that I mailed yesterday. I don't want them to be delivered. And he asked about the details and the addresses, and believe it or not, they gave me the letters back. Phew. In reality, I should have hesitated a day, 2, 3 before writing the letter, period. Or I could have written the letter and not mailed it. And we'll come back to that a little bit later on. The Bible repeatedly counsels that we, even in our fallen, sinful condition, have the capacity to control anger. And we looked at this comment last week from the Creator to Cain. Why are you angry, and why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin lies at the door, and its desire is for you. But you should rule over it. And that is the first indication that we have in the Bible that anger management classes were available for the human race. Don't know exactly what class, what kind of support group Cain would have gone to, but the Creator gives the impression, you should get a grip on this, Cain. You should rule over it. And the Bible repeatedly makes statements of this nature. We're going to look at just a small fraction. Psalm 37:8. Refrain from anger and forsake wrath. Fret not yourself. It tends only to evil. Proverbs 14:29. Whoever is slow to anger has great understanding, but he who has a hasty temper exalts folly. Also from that portion of the Bible which we call the wisdom literature, Ecclesiastes chapter 7. Be not quick in your spirit to become angry, For anger lodges in the bosom of fools. You see the pattern here again and again. Proverbs 19:11. Good sense makes one slow to anger, and it is his glory to overlook an offense. That's one way. Again, we'll come back to that a little bit later. From the New Testament, we find the same tone. James chapter 1. My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. Do you see the pattern here? Refrain, slow, be not quick, slow. You should rule over it. All of this does not come to us automatically by default. We have to be intentional about this kind of response. To review, we looked at this last week. Anger is an intense emotional state involving a strong, uncomfortable, and non-cooperative response to a perceived, it could also be real, but it could just as well be perceived, provocation, hurt, or threat. And we gave a little bit more emotional, visceral definition. Anger is that grrr feeling. Manifested with physical effects, increased heart rate, elevated blood pressure, triggering that fight or flight response, facial expressions, body language, physical aggression. We're just reviewing here a little bit from last week. All sorts of things trigger us. Someone cut you off in line. Someone misunderstood what you said. Someone ignored your feelings. A relationship breaks up. You feel trapped, smothered, and controlled. You feel like a failure. Someone broke your trust. Some of these are more significant than others. You were abused. That's very significant. You were lied to. You had to wait in a very long checkout line. Your kids are not obeying you. The waitress is very slow, and then he or she brings the wrong food. Your spouse forgot to call and tell you that he or she is going to be late. Your spouse has been unfaithful. That is huge. You should be angry if your spouse has been unfaithful. Your kids relentlessly demand your time. You forgot to do something you were supposed to do. You don't have time for yourself. Someone said something harsh and insensitive. Your boss does not appreciate you. The driver in front of you is going very, very slow. All of these are triggers and more. Someone close to you dies. And that's initially a legitimate reason to be angry with God. Yeah. In spite of it, the Bible tells us you should rule over it. And in our time together before, we spent most of that focus on acknowledging our anger. And we saw that there are three basic masks of anger, three faces of anger. Spewers, biblical example, Saul. Stuffers, biblical example, Abigail. Leakers, biblical example, Moses and Paul. Now, if you're still kind of wondering what those terms refer to, spewers, stuffers, leakers, you can get an idea of that just from the term itself. But if you want to see that unpacked a little bit more in detail, just access the first message in this two-part series on the church website. So step one in ruling over anger is to acknowledge our anger. Step two is to recognize that God has allowed this, whatever this is, to happen. And we might say that this is a larger contextual framework to dealing with anger. God has allowed this to happen, whatever it is. Now, sometimes we self-sabotage. stuff that we do to ourselves or that we do to others triggers an anger event. But oftentimes, we didn't do anything. And we become the recipients of anger. We become the victims of anger even. Whatever it is, God has allowed that to happen. Psalm 139. O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know my sitting down and my rising up. You understand my thought from afar off. You comprehend my path and my lying down. You are acquainted with all my ways. Lord, there is not a word on my tongue, but behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. You have hedged me behind and before. You have laid your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high. I cannot attain it. I would agree. God's foreknowledge of us, past, present, future, and how that interacts with our personal choices, I don't have that all figured out. Nobody has that all figured out. But yet that is what the Bible reveals to us. Even the impact of others' personal choices upon us that damage us. God knows about that. He knows it's going to take place before it even happens. In your book, the psalmist goes on. They were all written, the days fashioned for me, as yet there were none of them. Someone does you wrong. God knew that was going to happen. We'll look back at some of our biblical examples that we've already visited with Spear Saul. God knew that women in Israel, when the Israel armies were returning to home, would sing, Saul has slain his thousands, and David has slain his 10,000s. Oh, that triggered Saul, caused him to have jealousy, which would morph into anger. God knew about Jonathan and David's friendship before their friendship even formed. He knew that Saul, as we saw previously, would actually use vulgar language towards his son Jonathan. God knew Saul, all his ways. God knew about the suffering of Abigail. God knew that Abigail would marry the fool Nabal and feel trapped in a disappointing, unfulfilling marriage. He knew that was going to happen. God knew about Moses. He knew that the day would come when the pressure would just ratchet up little by little by little. And on this designated day, Moses could not contain it any longer. Must we fetch for you, rebels, water out of this rock? God knew that Moses' anger would go from simmer to boil. He knew that Naaman would become furious, that Naaman had these expectations. Indeed, I said to myself, the man of God, he will surely come out and he will stand and call on the name of his God and he'll wave his hand over the place and I will be healed of my leprosy. God knew that Naaman had expectations and they would be unfulfilled. God knew that Job would cry out, I loathe my life. How long, Lord, will you not look away from me and let me alone till I swallow my saliva? Have I sinned, God? What have I done to you, O watcher of men? Why have you set me as your target so that I am a burden to myself? This is a challenge to acknowledge that God has allowed it to happen. And some of the it's are very, very severe and damaging. And it causes us to wonder at times, does this have any purpose at all? Or is this just futile? Is this just senseless? Is there any reason for this? It seems like there's no reason for it. In James 1, we read this last week, but to review it again in this context now this morning, James, the brother of Jesus, says, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature, complete, not lacking anything." And then in that same flow of thought, just a few verses later, just a few sentences later, James writes, "My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to become angry." As we've already noted, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. So what's the purpose of it? It is that we may, through this experience, grow in Christ-likeness and become mature, complete, not lacking anything. Recognize that God has allowed this to happen to you. Step number 3 is similar, but it's got a little bit different nuance to it. Recognize that I am in a war. You are in a war. Ephesians chapter 4, the apostle writes, "Be angry and do not sin." That actually, be angry is in the imperative form. It's almost a command. "But do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your wrath, nor give place to the devil." Now, we don't have time to look at the entire letter to the Ephesians. It's actually one of my favorite biblical documents for a number of reasons. Because in it, we are told how precious we are to God in chapter 1. In chapter 2, we are told that salvation is not through works, but it is by grace through faith. In chapter 3, we are told about the mystery of God that's being revealed through this amazing organism and organization called the church. How God is bringing together people from diverse backgrounds and bringing them into community with one another. And in chapter 4, then, the apostle transitions from what we believe to how we are to behave. He says, "Now walk worthy of the calling with which you have been called." And it's in that context that the apostle writes, "Be angry and do not sin." But in chapter 6, as he's coming to a close, he helps us to understand that we are in a war. "Put on the whole armor of God," he writes, "that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in heavenly places." When we're in an anger context, an anger situation, we're in the battle right there. Peter talks about it in these terms. You're familiar with this saying from Peter. "Humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time, casting all your care upon him, for he cares for you. Now, be sober and be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour." Jesus puts the war in these contexts from the leader of the enemy. In John chapter 8, speaking of the devil, Jesus says, "He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own resources, for he is a liar and a father, the father. He is a liar and the father of it." So when we can breathe deep, by the way, that's really a good, immediate action to take when you feel something rise within you. Time out, 10 deep breaths. But when we realize we're in the heat of battle, we are in this war, do I really want to inflict damage by spewing, going nuclear, pounding nails in the heart of another? You know, in our current international context, there's been this hesitancy for NATO countries to engage because we don't rush to go nuclear. Even though it seems like that talk is becoming more and more probable on some scale. But we're in the heat of it. Do I really want to? Yes, at the moment you feel like inflicting damage, but if I can just back up a couple of steps, do I really want to go nuclear, pounding nails in the heart of another? Do I really want to give the best speech I could ever regret? Do I really want to inflict physical harm upon another person? No, we don't. When I'm in the battle with it, do I really want to destroy myself by stuffing again and again and again, in which bitterness and resentment begins to layer one upon the other until someday it leaks out and you react against a person, whether it's your boss or a family member, and I've had enough, I'm done. When I'm in a war with anger, do I really want to silo myself by leaking? Do I want to withdraw? Do I want to become isolationist? For all these and a host of other reasons, the Bible gives us this counsel again from James chapter 1. Be slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. Step 4. Process, decide, act. Process, decide, act. Process with prayer. Emotionally unload on God. Emotionally unload on God with the anger situation. You know, there are certain categories given to the Psalms. Some are lament. Others are what scholars call, got to get this pronunciation right, imprecatory psalms. And Psalm 109 is an example of that. This is from David, actually. Do not keep silent, O God of my praise, for the mouth of the wicked and the mouth of the deceitful have opened against me. They have spoken against me with a lying tongue. They have also surrounded me with words of hatred and fought against me without a cause. In return for my love, they are my accusers, but I give myself to prayer. Thus, they have rewarded me evil for good and hatred for my love. Here it comes. Set a wicked man over him and let an accuser stand at his right hand. When he is judged, let him be found guilty and let his prayer become sin. Let his days be few and let another take his office. Let his children be fatherless and his wife a widow. Let his children continually be vagabonds and beg. Let them seek their bread also from desolate places. Let the creditor seize all that he has, and let strangers plunder his labor. Let there be none to extend mercy to him, nor let there be any favor to his fatherless children. Do you get an idea that David is unpacking here? Let his posterity be cut off, and in the generation following, let their name be blotted out. God, I want you to take it out not only on him and his immediate family, but take it out on his descendants. Now, if that's in the Bible, that's an invitation for us to come to God with all of the intensity of emotion that we are dealing with. Get it out in prayer. God's already listened to it with individuals long before us. Another way to process is exercise. Take a walk, take a run, take a ride, swim, lift, write, journal, write a letter. In one story that I heard in preparation for this particular message today, a pastor was talking about his personal experience in which someone had injured him, had really damaged his reputation, and he was just livid about this situation. And in his wisdom, he did seek the counsel of a contemporary, and his contemporary listened and helped him kind of work through it. And he said, well, write a letter, write a letter to this individual. And so he did. And he brought it back, and he read the letter to his sounding board. He said, okay, well, why don't you kind of put that in your briefcase for a week or two, and then let's talk again. So they got back a week later. They looked at the letter again, and his friend, confidant, said, now, what is the purpose? What is your purpose here in this letter? And with time and talking, the pastor who had been so greatly offended and damaged was able to let it go. Walk, run, swim, bike, exercise, write it out, process through listening to praise music. Because our emotions can change from half hour to half hour, and even more frequently or with a less time interval than that. Process, emotionally unload, decide, and then act. Decide and then act. Going back to James chapter 1, quick to listen, slow to speak. And then from Ephesians 4, be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down in your wrath. That could literally refer to the sunset that particular day, but it could also refer, you got to do something about it eventually. Don't just bury it and stuff it. So I referred to this resource last week, Overcoming Emotions That Destroy, by Chip Ingram and Dr. Becca Johnson. And Dr. Becca Johnson is a counselor. Chip Ingram is a pastor, and he was the one presenting this material, but he relied and referred quite often to Counselor Johnson. So we come to that point, we ask the question, what should I do? Do I express it directly? Do I confront this person? Or do I release it indirectly and I conceal it? And it all depends. There are so many unique circumstances and history to each situation. One cannot provide a formula, an approach that would be best in every situation. So this is where you and others around you, we have to rely upon some counsel maybe that we'll get from a trusted confidant. But here's just a general approach to consider from Dr. Becca Johnson. We find ourselves in an unwanted situation with angry feelings, that when we find ourselves, we basically have two choices. Do I want to express my feelings directly to the person, or do I release them indirectly through various activities? Dealing with it directly means choosing to confront the situation. We try and change it. We act rather than acquiesce. We take action and appropriately let the person involved know about our anger and its root emotions and what contributed to their existence and what we would like to see become different. It is best to express ourselves clearly without blaming or attacking. We let our anger be known. We get it out wisely and carefully, never impulsively without consideration of the consequences and causalities. That's one approach, to confront. Dealing with anger in the other mode, indirectly, gives us more options. Sometimes it's best to accept things the way they are and not to share our anger with those involved. In other words, we conceal it. We choose this option not by default or out of hopelessness, but out of a calculated conclusion. Very important qualifier there. But out of a calculated conclusion that it would be best not to stir the waters or rock the boat at this particular time in this particular situation. Wisdom demands sometimes that we choose not to provoke or to reprove someone when past history or other circumstances dictate it to be an unwise practice. Sometimes we have to find a new job, do business with a different company, or discontinue an unhealthy relationship. We choose not to confront, but to quit. We should consider this only after we have weighed all other options carefully and determined that letting go is the best course of action. Worthy of our reflection again and again and again. Step 4, process. Emotionally unload. Decide. Adjust our expectations. I've shared this with some of you. In the 12-step community, there's a saying, expectations are anticipated resentments. We saw that in the case with Naaman from a biblical example. But expectations are anticipated resentments. So how do we rule over anger? We acknowledge our anger. We recognize that God has allowed it to happen, whatever it is. We recognize that we are in a war. We process. We emotionally unload. We decide and we act. And step 5, consider Jesus. Consider Jesus and the hostility that he endured. Hebrews chapter 12. Consider him who endured such hostility against himself. Just a blanket phrase. Example of that from Luke chapter 23, on the cross, Jesus says, Father, forgive them. They do not know what they do. Jesus was abused beyond belief. It was not fair. It was not just. We never see any instance in which Jesus is expressing anger over some assault upon himself. Now, as you well know, Jesus did get angry. But his anger was directed at other issues. He got angry when his father's house was misused and abused. He got angry when he saw other people being abused. He got angry. He called the religious leaders vipers and snakes over the distortion of God's character that they were propagating. So when we think about it, whatever it is that has happened to us, along with all those steps that we've looked at, just remember Jesus and how he related to anger. The apostle in Romans 12 has good concluding counsel. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it is possible, the implication is sometimes it's not. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, it is mine to avenge. I will repay, says the Lord. If the person who has offended us, if the person who has abused us, if the person who has inflicted whatever it is upon us, there's a possibility that that person in the future will repent. And like the thief on the cross will say, Lord, remember me. And if not, there's an all-wise God who will exercise what is just for that person in due time. The danger and opportunity of anger. You should rule over it. I should rule over it. We should rule over it. Acknowledge our anger. Recognize that God has allowed this. Recognize that I'm in a war. Process, decide, act, and keep the example of Jesus circulating in our consciousness. I think of Job, and in the end, he was able to experience joy and contentment and connectedness once again. Oh, he went through a horrendous experience. But God brought him through that, not only for his maturity, but for ours as well. And so we invite you this morning, as you reflect on all of these considerations with anger, that in spite of what you may be going through right now, in spite of what you may be confronted with this week or next month, we do have a good, good Father.